Howdy, howdy. How y'all doing? You feeling poppin', or are things bad? And not bad like 90s bad, just bad. That's 1890s, by the way. Bad's been good for a very long time. Tubular, right? I think it's pretty swag. Yeet! So that's exaggerating a little, but I'm very much a mixed bag of slang from everywhere and every time in the US. I grew up surrounded by 80s media. I went to a public school where I had to get every other word defined to me because I couldn't find them in a dictionary. And my grandfather regularly supplies me with lists of words that I'm convinced only he uses. And I'll tell you, it's been 4 years since the first time I heard the word yeet. I still don't know what it means. I'm deeply passionate about language, but there's this one area in English and language arts classes that if we talk about it at all, we don't talk about with the same degree of sophistication, largely because it's seen as unsophisticated. Slang. If you're a kid using slang around adults, you'll tend to notice that they think it sounds stupid. If you're an adult hearing kids use slang, you'll think it sounds stupid. But does it? Is it really a good or bad slang? Why is the way they talk so different? So much worse than the way we talk? Before we get into this, we first have to define what slang is and why it happens. So, what is it? Most people will tell you something to the effect of D.W. Moore's definition: unconventional words or phrases that express either something new or something old in a new way. That's pretty broad, though. That's most words. So, how can we get more in depth? Well, slang is kind of tricky to define like that. Amos Perons suggests that it's difficult because it's a colloquial variety of language. Some experts describe it as below the level of neutral style, and it's important also to know that it's very often characteristic of specific social groups. But there are multiple types of language, despite this difficulty. I mean, if you ever take an English class, then you'll certainly hear about the multiple levels of diction: formal, informal, academic, etc. But there's more to it than that. David J. Peterson, linguist and creator of the Dothraki language used in Game of Thrones, lays out a couple of these sub-languages in his book, The Art of Language Invention. You're all probably familiar with dialects, things like Mandarin, Cantonese, and Chinese, or Canadian French compared to regular French. But there's another one you're probably unfamiliar with, at least on a technical level: jargon. Jargon, as Peterson defines it, is a subset of vocabulary particular to a community's experiences and environment that outsiders won't know. Because slang is so limited to certain social groups and appears limited to certain generations, it tends to get conflated with jargon. There's a degree of truth to this, though. But slang isn't the jargon of a profession or a field, it's the jargon of identities. So now we know what it is, but why does it happen? Largely because of various cultural events. Slang is often determined by the pop culture and political climate of a given era. One major popularizer can be celebrities. It's difficult to say whether these figures just help popularize the terms or actually invent them themselves, but for a pretty clear-cut instance, let's take a look at the term shook. This came about in the 1890s, originally in the sense of disturbed, like it's used now, but it was also used in the phrase shook up, meaning party, ready to party, or all excited. This term kind of dropped off for a little while until it came back in around 1957 because of Elvis Presley. And if there was anything that defined the youth culture of the 50s, it was the King. I'm sure if The Rock used Gee Willikers tomorrow, half of us would be quoting him. Another major popularizer can be tech. For instance, Matt Daniels suggests that the internet is a catalyst for the term dank meme. And this must be true because meme came about in the 70s. It wasn't a term born of the internet. Its first usage was in Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, from 1976. However, despite its common usage on the internet, its definition hasn't shifted hardly at all. It's still a unit of cultural transmission, a unit of imitation, just as he originally suggested. The captioned images, the widespread quotes, or the good old days of the hamster dance, as some of you are familiar with, these are all units of cultural transmission, though I doubt we think of them as such. In this case, slang got dissociated from its original definition and morphed to fit the devices of the time. This is something that really happens a lot. Slang has a bad habit of adapting to the times, and an even worse habit of sticking around. So, as we've already discussed, slang is the jargon of identities. Jargon functions for ease of communication and to make sure certain ideas get across in the fewest words possible. Slang does this for a community rather than a profession or field. It makes ideas and feelings far easier to get across and acts as a way to convey that you belong. It's your group, your words. Perron also suggests this usage of slang not just as communication of ideas, but also as a social identifier. If I were to use the word wicked to mean really good, it would be ridiculous because this is the slang of young people. This occurs beyond just generational usage, of course. It can be a marker of class, background, various parts of your background, like ethnicity. But the trouble is, slang is, in most situations, not discussed in these terms. When we associate it entirely with something that just the youngins use, we erase so many valuable parts of a person's identity. Within language arts and academia, as well as with most people from a different age group, slang and its usage is almost entirely conflated with a given generation. The thing is, that's just not the right way to go about it. My father didn't pick up staying woke because he associated with any of his identifiers, though. He picked it up because he wanted to understand more of the ways my generation speaks, even though I've never used those words. It's being used as a marker to divide people rather than to identify them. What's important to realize here, though, is that slang always fills similar roles and niches. Ultimately, no matter what the words look like, they still have the same reasons for existing. It's not fair to berate people or the language they speak for conforming to the trends of their community. Look, like, beyond them being metaphorically the same, they're literally the same. Literally, not slang literally. Lit, not literally, and not literally lit, for instance, has existed for over a century, yet the definition has only just shifted. If you were around in, let's say, the 90s, you were probably first exposed to the term lit through one of the rappers of the time. It was part of Camp Lo's biggest hit, Lucchini. Now pop the cork and steam the Vega and let's get lit. If you're my age, you're only going to interpret this lyric mildly different than someone my parents' age or grandparents' age would. Lit has meant intoxicated or drunk since at least the 1910s. This recent morph into partying or a good time started sometime in the 2000s, and it stems directly from this original meaning. It's a pretty easy jump for most to make. Slang does this a lot. It sticks and only just changes. I can't begin to understand adults who mock the way kids talk, when chances are they were using the same words. And look, fellow kids, I know we all cringe pretty hard when mom or dad use shook or bay or lit, but those words have been around well long enough to be theirs too. Say what you will about not understanding the way kids talk these days, or not really getting why grandpa talks that way, and all you're saying is the same thing. When we shunt slang to the side, we put off kids from speaking it around their elders, which widens the communication gap and makes all of us harder to understand. We avoid including it in our fiction, and suddenly our characters become robotic, devoid of that vital linguistic spark. Words become something shameful, something taboo and secretive. There are so many benefits to potentially talking about this in educational settings, not least of which is the ability for adults and kids to start talking to each other more comfortably. It's communicable. It's fun. It's become at least a small part of each and every one of us as we've grown up, no matter where or when we lived. If slang represents who we are, what are we really doing when we mock people for the way they talk?